exciting. Okay, that takes us through now to item 9, which is the timing of the consultation for the drafts of Three Waters. But before we move on to that report in its entirety, we'd just like to welcome Helen Beaumont, who's going to give us a verbal update on the Water Services Act. Thanks, Helen.
Thank you. So one of the things you'll note is that the Three Waters Bylaws updates, the papers predated the latest announcement on water reform and the passage of the Water Services Act. So while we're not changing our recommendations in that paper, it's worth giving you just a brief update of what those changes were. So in terms of the Water Services Act, the commencement date has been announced as the 15th of November this year. So at that date, the responsibility for the regulation and enforcement of standards in drinking water passes from the Ministry of Health across to Taumata Arawai. And that includes responsibility for our water safety plans. So I'll touch on those as well. One of the things, though, is that Section 58, which relates to the exemption from the chlorine residual, has a commencement date of the 1st of March 2022. So any application for an exemption must wait until after the 1st of March 2022. There are some other things that have not yet commenced as well, but they are largely relating to wastewater and stormwater. So the Taumata Arawai is clearly focusing on drinking water first, as was indicated by Parliament as that bill was going through. So in terms of the water safety plans, there are some additional requirements in the Water Services Act. The first one that has the greatest impact around the country is that all community water supplies must have a water safety plan. Previously, it was just supplies serving more than 500 people. Here in Christchurch, we have always had water safety plans for all of our community supplies, even the very small ones across on Banks Peninsula. So that change won't really affect us in a big way. Under that new legislation, those water safety plans need to be submitted to the regulator, but Taumata Arawai is not approving those plans. So that is a change compared to the drinking water assessor process with the Ministry of Health. We do expect the regulator to review them and provide feedback back to us. So we're waiting to see what the format of that will be. The revision of our water safety plan will include some of those additional requirements. So principally that is about having to have a source water risk management plan. And we have that largely already for our Christchurch supply, and we will need to do more work on those source water risk management plans across on Banks Peninsula. But we will be expanding on work that we have already done and working with Environment Canterbury on those. The other thing is that the risk tables will be updated to take account of work that has been completed over the last year, and that is in particular around backflow, where we have resolved 99% of the unacceptable backflow risk, and the last half dozen premises that need backflow will be resolved over the next few weeks. So that risk will become an acceptable risk given the upgrades to the infrastructure across the city. And we will also reassess the risk from lead contamination. So we had the risk from lead contamination from those old cast iron jointed lead pipes as an unacceptable risk in our current proposed water safety plan. However, we've now done sufficient work across the city that we have monitoring information from all of the areas affected by those lead jointed pipes, and it's quite clear that we do not breach the drinking water standards in any of those areas. So once again, that risk will be rolled back to an acceptable risk. That will not change the replacement program that we have for those lead jointed mains, particularly where they are dead ends, because while we comply with the standards, no lead is good in a water supply. So we are continuing to work to minimise the potential for leaching from those mains. So those two risk changes will be made. The big question, though, for everybody is when will we return to chlorine-free water? And there's not a simple answer to that. So there's a number of things that need to be in place. First of all, we need to have the new water safety plan lodged and accepted by Taumata Arawai, whatever that acceptance now means. Under our existing approved water safety plan, even if we upgrade wellheads, resolve backflow risks and resolve any reservoir issues, we still have to have a 0.2 part per million chlorine residual because we don't have that double sign-off on the wellheads, which you'll all recall is in our existing approved water safety plan. So we're sort of in limbo, complying with an existing water safety plan and operating a lot of our network in accordance with the revised and much better new water safety plan. But there's still some regulatory compliance things that prevent us from removing that 0.2 parts per million chlorine that's across a lot of the city. So once we have that new water safety plan in place and replace the existing one, we will be able to remove chlorine progressively across the city as we resolve those three issues that I touched on. The wellheads are raised, and under the new Water Services Act, they must be above ground. So we do have some below ground wellheads that have been signed off as secure, but they will no longer meet the new regulatory framework. So those, we had about 8 of them that you'll recall we did some remedial works on, but they are still below ground, so those ones will progressively be raised. The second one is the backflow prevention. That one is largely resolved and will not require residual chlorine under the new plan. And then the third one is about the reservoirs and suction tanks. We have undertaken some works on reservoirs and suction tanks, but there is more to come, and we'll give you a full update on the rolling program of inspections, remedial works and renewals of those reservoirs and suction tanks. So I think the final thing is just to note that the Water Services Act and that change just reinforces that we continue to operate in a changing regulatory environment for our three waters networks, and the bylaws do indeed respond to that. So I'm happy to take any quick questions on that, but we will get you a written update following this meeting.
Thanks, Helen. I've got Leanne, then Jimmy, then Aaron.
Thanks very much for that. Can you do a little bit of a description around the reservoirs and suction tanks? Because I mean, obviously that's the one that that has a considerable amount of work in it, but it doesn't mean that we can't have an ambition to get an exemption until every single one of them has been brought up to scratch.
Yeah, that's correct. So just as removing chlorine has always been a progressive exercise. It's not that we either have it or we don't. So there are a number of pump stations across the city already that do not have chlorine, and that's where we have the double sign-off of the wells. We have no issues with the reservoirs and suction tanks in that zone, and in the zone of influence of the pump station, and all of the backflow risk has been resolved. So that will continue to happen across the city, pump station by pump station and zone by zone. The reservoirs and suction tanks, what we have done is exactly the same thing as was done for the wellheads. So we have raised the bar in terms of the condition of those reservoirs and suction tanks before we will accept them as being demonstrably safe in terms of the operation of our network. So under the previous water safety plan, a reservoir or suction tank may have passed our criteria for being okay in the network, but under the new water safety plan, it has to meet a higher standard. So in terms of the program, we have 50 reservoirs across the Port Hills, and we have another 18 reservoirs around Littleton Harbour, and then
18,
we have
did you say?
18, yes, yeah. 18, yep. So there's 15 sites, but some of them have 2 tanks, so that's why the numbers are so large over there. And then we have 25 suction tanks at primary pump stations across the city. So not every pump station has a suction tank, and indeed at some pump stations we're bypassing the suction tank where we're doing some remedial works. In terms of the demonstrably safe criteria, we put that together must be 18 months ago, and we've been rolling out an inspection program. So we've done all of the external inspections, and we're working through the internal inspections. Internal inspections generally can only take place in the winter, when we can take the tanks offline and continue to operate the network with the remaining pump stations in that zone. We can do a limited number in the summer, just in those zones where we've got plenty of capacity, but not a lot. While we've been rolling that across the city, we have, now that we're revising our water safety plan, we're going to take another look at that demonstrably safe criteria, and the criteria within that are quite detailed. And there's two reasons for that. One is we want to be satisfied that we're being strict enough with our reservoirs, and the other is that we want to be satisfied we're not being too strict with our reservoirs. So we're going to review the performance of that demonstrably safe criteria against the inspections that we've done to date, and cross-check it against the microbiological monitoring that we do for each of those reservoirs, to make sure that we're doing the right thing in terms of minimising the risk of contamination to the drinking water system. So there's quite a bit of revision and review going in there to feed into the new water safety plan, and to then feed into that reservoir and suction tank program. And as you know, we have also put in an application for further funding in the annual plan for the reservoir and suction tank program, and reprioritise the work across the drinking water network, recognising that it is the reservoirs and suction tanks where we need to do most of the upgrade works.
So does that mean that there is still an intention to lodge a water safety plan with Te Mata Arawai this time that has dealt with the unacceptable risks and brought us into that acceptable risk space?
That'll be true for the lead and the backflow. That won't be true for all of the reservoirs and suction tanks. However, what the water safety plan will do is it'll put in place the risk management framework and the remedial actions that we will take to progressively move those reservoirs and suction tanks into the demonstrably safe category, and then that's associated with taking the chlorine out in that particular zone. So the water safety plan is always a living document, so it always responds to the state of the network as it is, any changes in the regulatory arrangements, and anything that we find in our network. So that will continue to be so. So it will define that where there is a reservoir or suction tank in the zone that does not meet the criteria, then residual chlorine will continue to be used in that part of the zone.
So the nature of the exemption that we would be applying for after March 1 next year would be an exemption that is that happens on a zone by zone basis as that last remaining unacceptable risk is removed.
Yes, it would, but it would also be a dynamic one. So at all times, that zone must meet the criteria, and if there's an incident or something found at a reservoir, even if we have an exemption for that zone, if we find an issue with the reservoir, we would reintroduce chlorine.
Absolutely, and this is, I guess, my little sense of frustration is that when people go, oh God, here goes the Mayor of Christchurch again, on chlorine, we chlorinate when we need to.
Yes.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So,
Yes.
so there are things that can happen. There are things that can go wrong. We can pick up things as we go, and that will always lead us to take appropriate steps.
That's correct, and we have always used chlorine in our network in that temporary and targeted fashion.
Yeah.
So yes, that will continue.
All right. So, so you do feel that we'll be in a position to make an application after March next year?
Yes.
Provided that we've had the feedback from Te Mata Arawai. So I'm assuming that we put in the water safety plan, and we're aiming for the end of the year still.
Yes.
We put that in. They don't have to approve it anymore, which but they will provide us with feedback.
That's our expectation.
And
yes.
we would want to be able to assess that feedback and make adjustments as appropriate. because you really wouldn't want to ignore the regulator. I mean, I do think that I get a bit frustrated too that the Ministry of Health has got out of this scot-free, because I'm not entirely happy with how Havelock North actually happened. And, the government had to put in place a completely new regulator to take control of this. So we'll listen to the regulator, and then we would assess our position about applying for an exemption.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Great. And just on that, I know I've got Jimmy, Aaron and Yanni. So you talked about the reservoirs and suction tanks, and you've done all the external inspections are complete. What are you up to in the internal? How many of those have you done?
I haven't got that detail to hand. I'm sorry, and we will pull that together for you though, and give you an update of where we are.
Because that is a 5-year rolling program.
Yes, and we usually give you an update to each Three Waters Infrastructure and Environment Committee meeting. So your next meeting is 8th of December, so that would be your next programmed update.
That'd be good. And do they have to be double signed off like the wellheads?
No, that's a bespoke arrangement that was in response to the Director General of Health coming down. You'll recall that we had a discussion with the Director General of Health and the Medical Officer of Health.
So do we determine when we feel that they're demonstrably safe ourselves?
No, we get a specialist
advice.
to specialist advice on those, just as with the wellheads.
Yep, great, thank you. Okay, so what did I say? Jimmy, and then Aaron, and then Yanni.
Okay, thank you. I follow the end question. Particularly existing drinking water safety plan. You mentioned all those regulator or successor change to the Tomata ROI. Whether already transfer all the existing drinking water safety plan to them or not yet. I just want to know.
So the transfer takes place on the 15th of November. So we will
still waiting for it.
So from the 15th of November, and we have all of the contact details and we've met all of the people involved.
Yes.
We will report to Taumata Arawai
Yes.
in terms of compliance audits of our water safety plan, any incident response, any transgression notifications. That will all go through Taumata Arawai.
Yeah, I know, yeah. But how about the time frame? Whether it's before the 1st of March of the next year, they will reply to us. Then until 1st of March of next year, we need to submit the drinking water safety plan.
We will submit that by the end of this year.
The end of this year.
Yes.
So it's replace our existing one.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Existing one, which is still current. Aaron.
Yeah, Helen, so on the 8 underground ones that don't pass the new...
The below ground ones, yes.
Below ground ones. How much did we spend on those?
They were...
I waited to find out what the rules were.
They were sort of between 100 and 300,000
Each?
each, yes.
Right, so 1.5, 1.2, ballpark. Right. Okay, thank you.
Yanni?
Yeah, thank you. Are you able to give us any update on the fluoridation?
No.
Because I was just interested if,
Diane?
I know in the past when we've had advice on it, there's a huge cost, and I'm just wondering how much work related to that is related to the water safety plan.
So Diane Shalander has been looking at the passage of the legislation through Parliament. However, in terms of what we've been doing when we've been upgrading our wellheads and our pump stations, we have known for the last 3 years that there's a potential for fluoride to come. So any upgrades have made provision for the potential of addition of fluoride to those new pump stations. There would be a considerable amount of work to add it to some of the older pump stations, but we can do that work and have a look at what the estimated costs are, and likely we would need to do that.
Well, I just wonder if anyone's talking to the Ministry of Health, because it seems like Ashley's going to be in charge of either forcing us to do it or not.
There was a submission made, I understand, a couple of years ago that did do some estimate of what those costs were, so we could pull that out for you.
Okay. And just like, so just in terms of the water safety plan, so the current one where we get sign off from the drinking water assessor and an engineer.
The double sign off of the wellheads, yes.
Yeah.
So you get a specialist in the wellhead inspection and then the drinking water assessor.
So with all the changes that has happened, is that the new water regulator?
There are still drinking water assessors, and those drinking water assessors now report to Te Mata Arawai rather than to the Ministry of Health. Yes.
So we need Te Mata Arawai to sign it off, not like Waikamply who's doing a water safety plan.
We need a drinking water assessor, whoever they're employed by or
And
contracted to. Yes.
Have we talked to Waikamply to say, can you sign these ones off where we've done the work now that we've done everything that we said we'd do?
No, our work with Waikamply has been around the approval of the new water safety plan, not about varying the old one.
Okay, so I'm just trying to understand the sign-off process, which the Ministry of Health basically said no more sign-offs even though we've done the work and we spent all the money. Is that process still on hold?
That's correct. And that was agreed to put that on hold, and we agreed to revise our water safety plan in line with the new framework for water safety plans.
Right.
That's the mechanism.
So there's no chance of anything being removed at any of those other locations where we've done all the work?
That's correct. So it's contingent on getting the new water safety plan across the line.
Okay. Even though the risk that we currently have is the same as the ones that we don't currently have chlorination in?
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Helen. If there's no more questions. Oh, Leanne.
I guess the obvious
and
question
sorry. Go, Leanne.
that, is in relation to the requirement to have residual disinfection. There again seems to be a misunderstanding by some commentators. So the only way to have residual disinfection is chlorine, because it's the only one that stays in the pipe. So I don't think people understand what residual disinfection. I read something in the press the other day that had a quote from Napier saying that all that was required was residual disinfection. So we're going to apply UV.
Yes,
but
that's right.
That's not residual.
That's correct. So ultraviolet disinfection provides disinfection at the point
Yes.
at which the those ultraviolet lamps and the water passes through. There is no residual of that disinfecting agent in the water as it passes through the network. So that's correct. So it is chlorine that if you use chlorine for your point source disinfection, then it remains in the water throughout the network.
So where does that leave us with some parts of our water supply that don't have chlorine in it when the new Act comes into effect on the 15th?
So we've asked a whole lot of questions about that actually.
Yeah.
So because we're operating between two water safety plans, if you like, under an approved one,
Yeah.
and then under the proposed revised plan.
But there is a risk that Te Mata Arawai will come back and say you have to chlorinate.
We would need to look at the detail of the regulatory arrangements and the commencement dates for all of those different clauses to understand that.
So the whole Act doesn't take effect on the 15th?
That's what we'd need to understand.
Yeah.
And how they view an approved water safety plan and a proposed water safety plan.
Yeah, I just want to understand what the risks are, because I think the public are very, very concerned about continued chlorination. We started this from a temporary basis, and I've got this on my Mayor's report for tomorrow. But I think it's really important for people to understand that the goalposts have continually been shifting, and they've shifted again.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And we're not the ones shifting them.
No, but we're constantly meeting
Yes, we
every single bar as it's put in
And I
front
think
of us.
staff need to be acknowledged and
Yeah.
praised for that, because it's been a movable feast and with considerable cost.
And of
to
course, the
council.
other thing that I'm miffed about is reading people who should know better commenting in letters to the editor that our lack of care and attention to our water infrastructure is the reason that we're chlorinating, when it's got nothing to do with that at all.
No, we're one of the better councils. Thank you for pointing that out, Leanne. Phil, did you still have a question?
Yeah, thanks, Helen. Just remember this time last year we were in a bit of strife with a reservoir suction tank thing at, I'll say, Denton Park, is that all
In
up
December last year,
Yeah,
yes,
correct.
we had an issue with contamination in the Denton suction tank.
So we were sorting that one out, and then we were going to do the one at Sockburn.
That's
is that
correct.
right? Has the Denton one all finished? And
So we've bypassed the Denton tank.
yeah,
The works are largely complete. There's just one last piece that needs to be done when the weather is warm enough, and the weather is extraordinarily uncooperative.
okay. So roughly, when would you think that Denton would be back online?
That should be back online for the summer.
Okay, thank you. And then, come winter, perhaps we'll start on the Sockburn one.
No, the Sockburn one has started.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Great. That was good. Thank you, Helen. Sort of wandered into a Three Waters report then almost. So, we'll move into the
Back to the bylaws.
yes, the bylaws, and it just by way of introduction, that these bylaws are required by legislation in the Local Government Act, and as you've said, these Three Waters developments and the reforms does not change the need to proceed with these bylaw review process. So they're separate from the government reforms. I think it's really important to point that out. And we require these bylaws which are specific to our district in order to meet the conditions of our recently acquired comprehensive stormwater consent and other reasons connected to our stormwater functions, and to maintain good stewardship of our three waters. So over to you to introduce the item 9, which is the timing of the consultation for the draft Three Water bylaws.
So one of the key changes here do respond to some of those regulatory changes around drinking water. So that's there are more stringent requirements in there, and the bylaws will assist us with that, as well as you say, the stormwater consent conditions to improve the quality of those stormwater discharges. So the review process has, of course, been underway at the same time as the development of the water reform program, but we would like to continue and not delay any consultation on this. So the plan is to go out for consultation later this year. So 9th of December, I think, is our
29th of November.
29th of November, right through to February. So what water reform, well, it is going to continue, and there are still proposals that central government has to shift water services. Doesn't change what we need to continue to do over the next 2 to 3 years. And looking at what happened in Auckland, it is likely that the bylaws will simply, those requirements will simply transfer if the water services transfer. And we would like those bylaw conditions to be in the best possible state rather than outdated as they are now. So we're proposing that we have up-to-date and fit-for-purpose bylaw regulations in place. So we're happy to take questions on the timing if there are any.
Yeah, so we'll keep the questions just to the timing of the consultation, and then we'll move on to items 10 and 11, which are more about the bylaws themselves. So has anyone got any issues with the consultation? There's no perfect time to consult, but next year, in my view, would probably be worse. Yanni?
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate the longer time for engagement. I'm just interested in how much resource we've got into helping people understand what the impact will be, because obviously we've seen with the government propaganda that, you know, like, it's quite hard for people to distinguish between what's factual and what's kind of worrisome. And so I just wonder how much resource we have to help people understand at an individual level what the changes mean for them and how we're proposing to do that.
I think for individual residential connections, there's very little real change. The biggest changes are really for our commercial and industrial connections, and those are most of the bigger changes there are around the stormwater. So we will put some resources into that to help that sector understand. They are already, of course, responsive because we're doing proactive inspection and audit programs across the city for the stormwater compliance.
Great. Thank you. Any other questions? Oh, Sam?
Probably the really obvious one. I mean, will consulting on this confuse the public when we potentially have to go out and consult on, because I suspect we will, on government legislation around the reforms?
I don't think so. I don't think the public will be confused. I don't think that will stop people, though, making submissions on related issues because they see it as an opportunity to do that. So while they may or may not be confused, we do expect to get submissions that touch on other matters.
So is that additional information, is that something we could incorporate into, I guess, our submissions to the select committees over the water reforms and the like? If there is surplus, like, is there the capacity to do that?
We could, although I'm not sure that it's sort of statistically robust in terms of any consultation.
I guess it's just that crossover of the two issues, and if people are thinking they're just, submitting on Three Waters effectively.
Well, it might be more appropriate that if staff pick up a comment in the submissions to the bylaw that's actually more relevant to the Three Waters reform, that submitter is advised to then direct that comment through a different channel.
We could certainly do
without
that.
overloading you with a lot of work, but there may not be that many.
It's not unusual when we go out on bylaws to get other matters raised that people feel are related.
And if there were an overwhelming amount that were confused, then we might attach a note to our submission saying we had a lot of feedback through our bylaws because people were confused. Perhaps.
Okay, well, it'd be good if we could pick that up if it does become an
See
issue.
what happens. Okay, Leanne?
I think this paper is really important because it does highlight the fact that we've continued to invest in our Three Waters infrastructure through the long-term plan, and also that maintaining the good regulatory stewardship, I think is the phrase that you've used in the paper, is really important as well. But I wonder whether it would be helpful to do two things. One is to describe what this isn't as well as what it is, so that we are highlighting the fact that this is us exercising good regulatory stewardship in the wake of changes that are coming. But it's not that, because I would like the people who are genuinely interested in the bylaw elements to really focus on those, and then pick up any that come in, and provide sort of feedback to us on those, so that people we don't miss what people say. But the other thing is that to reinforce in the stormwater one the significance of the fact that it is not a networked element of a Three Waters infrastructure. It is quite separate. You've got a network of two waters, drinking water and wastewater. Stormwater is quite different, and that's your blue-green infrastructure that sits in around that. It's not all in pipes. It's not about pipes. And even though the bylaws deal with a lot of those issues, just reminding people that it is quite different from the rest, and our obligations under the global consent, global discharge consent is what's driving it being a separate bylaw, but that actually connects to the reason why it should be quite separate anyway.
Yeah, so it's quite correct that the stormwater is different in that it's an open network, whereas the drinking water and wastewater networks, we do our very best to keep those as closed networks. We don't want those interacting with the natural environment.
Or each other.
That is correct. So yes, so in stormwater, while most of the big changes are for the commercial and industrial premises, there are also some changes around overland flow paths. So that's where the water leaves the primary stormwater network and goes across private properties as well as public land, and also some thresholds for earthworks and sediments, because a lot of the answer to stormwater is in land use and better land use controls.
Yeah.
So there's some extra provisions in there.
Directly related to
I think land use and land use control is language that we should always use when we're talking about stormwater. I do think that this has been overlooked. By the officials advising the government on
And
Three
it's a
Waters.
particular challenge for us with those very erodible soils on the Port Hills. So
Absolutely.
we're very aware of that.
Tim's raised that many times. Yeah, thank you.
So, has it been moved, has it? No. So there's no other questions on this one. I'm happy to move this to go to consultation on the dates that the staff have recommended. And Leanne will second that. No discussion? Any discussion? All those in favour say aye. Aye. Opposed, that's carried. Thank you. So now we'll move on